Today I'm in North London and we're looking at Highgate Tube Station. Oh, not that Highgate Tube Station. This Highgate Tube Station. Or, as it's better known these days, Archway. Archway was originally known as Highgate when it first opened, and back then it was the terminus of what's now the Northern Line. So what's the story? Why was it called that? And why did the name change? The station was originally built by a company called the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway that was formed in 1891. The CCEHR was originally rather different, and in its early planning stages did not go to Archway. The original proposal was for a line from Charing Cross to Hampstead, with a short branch along the Euston Road to serve the main line termini of Euston and St Pancras. The Midland Railway, who owned St Pancras Station, objected to the idea of a tunnel under their big fancy station, so the branch was cut back to Euston. In 1899 the branch was cut altogether, with the line instead curving under Euston. At the same time it was decided to build another branch, from Camden Town to Kentish Town. The whole thing would be powered by clean, modern electricity. Parliamentary assent was received for this version of the line. But while all this was going on, there were problems behind the scenes. In 1891, investors had been very excited about the concept of tube railways, following the initial success of the pioneering City and South London Railway. But as time went on, the City and South London turned out not to be the money-printing machine its backers hoped, and this impacted other tube schemes. The CCEHR had immense trouble raising the capital to get their line built. Looking further and further afield, two of their agents went to Chicago and met with a man who had a track record when it came to track. One, Charles Tyson Yerkes. As it happened, they caught Yerkes at a good time. Or rather, a bad time from his point of view. He'd built a transport empire on bribery, blackmail, and some extremely shifty financial dealings. He'd even spent a little time in prison. Finally, though, the city fathers of Chicago were really cracking down. Legislation was not going his way. These gentlemen from London offered a way out. Yerkes sent his assistant, a man with the frankly fantastic name of Delancey Louderback, over to London to determine whether this CCEHR had legs. Louderback reported that it did, and so Yerkes bought them out for the sum of $200,000. He quickly put his own stamp on the project. He put forward two northern extensions. The Hampstead branch was now to terminate at Golders Green, and the Kentish Town branch at the Great Northern Railway Station at Highgate. Parliament rejected the full version of the Highgate extension, allowing the line only to go as far as Archway. As a compromise, the CCEHR named the new station Highgate, despite it not actually being in Highgate, and despite there already being a Highgate station. In 1902, construction began. The station was designed by architect Leslie Green, who was in charge of the stations on the CCEHR, and also the lines that would become the Piccadilly and Bakerloo lines, which were also part of the Yerkes Empire. It was typical of his style. Two entrances, a flat roof, and a frontage decorated in glazed oxblood tiles, with semicircular windows. Below ground there was a crossover, enabling trains to terminate at either platform. There was also a signal cabin. Now, I've been told off in the comments before for calling them signal cabins rather than the British term signal boxes. But lest we forget, it was American money paying for those early tubes, and they used American terminology that's stuck to this day. The station opened on the 22nd of June 1907. On the subject of American influence, the Yerkes tubes were subject to more than a little snobbery in the British press. For this reason. They were viewed as being somewhat low class. Guards and gatemen would call out the destination of the trains, and journalists accused them of pronouncing Highgate as Igit. So a bit of classism to go with your xenophobia there. These days, people seem divided as to whether it should be Highgate or Highgate. I say Highgate. Still, regardless of what the press thought, UERL had their own means of drumming up business. They issued postcards advertising the station, presenting it as a gateway to a bucolic rural fantasyland. They also advertised the CCEHR as the last link in the underground, which, of course, it was anything but. Now, the CCEHR may have been thwarted in their attempts to connect with the other Highgate station, But there Highgate was hardly isolated. Archway was well served by trams, and the Tube had an ace up their sleeve. The CCEHR was part of Underground Electric Railways of London, also known as the Combine, a collection of tube, bus and tram companies. UERL's management well understood the principle of integrated transport. They operated tram and bus services to feed into the Tube, giving them excellent coverage. As a matter of fact, they also used the buses to stamp on their rivals, and the situation at Archway was no exception. The thing about Highgate Station, the real Highgate Station, the one owned by the Great Northern Railway, is that it offered a fairly slow route into central London. It was an indirect and unreliable branch line train to Finsbury Park, then down the congested main line to King's Cross, and from there passengers would have to find their own way into the centre of town. The Tube, meanwhile, offered a speedy route through to the West End. UERL's hopes of stealing passengers from the North London branch line with a direct connection may have been thwarted, but they had a dirty trick in mind. London General, another constituent of UERL, began operating Route 111, which served Finsbury Park, Crouch End and Muswell Hill, all important local Great Northern stations. This poached an awful lot of railway passengers, and that would have an impact later on. The 111 still exists, but it's now the W7. I've kind of skipped over the trams because I think they merit a separate video. Suffice it to say for now that the Archway Tavern was a major landmark on the tram map as well. Archway itself underwent a number of changes in the first half of the 20th century. In 1912 it gained an additional entrance. With all those buses and trams, the station could get very busy in rush hour. In 1926, the CCEHR was physically connected to the City and South London Railway, which UERL had bought out in 1913, and that meant that passengers at Archway could get to the city as well as the West End. When the station opened, passengers reached the platforms by way of lifts. But lifts just can't do the job as well as an escalator, so the station underwent a rebuild to install escalators. At the same time, the secondary entrance was replaced with a simple but elegant frontage designed by Charles Holden. The rebuild was completed in 1931. But more changes were on the way. It seemed that UERL would achieve their dream of getting to Highgate and beyond. In 1933, UERL, along with every public transport provider other than the mainline railway companies, was absorbed into London Transport. The concept of a centralised organisation that could plan all of London's transport services was something UERL themselves had been calling for decades. And as they were by far the largest constituent of London Transport, their executives effectively took control. One of London Transport's first orders of business was the New Works programme. This would use the organisation's powers to create a more modern, more efficient and more logical system. Part of this was what has become known as the Northern Heights programme. This would have seen the Great Northern Railway's branch lines to High Barnet, Edgware and Alexandra Palace absorbed into the Underground, as well as the Northern City line. There would also be an extension to Bushey Heath. The part that's relevant to us is that the tube line to Archway would be extended up to meet the old Great Northern line at East Finchley. Along the way it would pass beneath the station at Highgate proper, and there would be platforms built there. Oh, and as part of this, the combined CCEHR, City and South London, Northern City and Great Northern lines would be renamed the Northern Line in 1937. With that in mind, London Transport couldn't allow there to be two Northern Line stations called Highgate. Granted, having two stations with the same name has hardly stopped them before, looking at you Hammersmith, looking at you Edgware Road, but these stations were a long way apart. So in 1939, Archway was renamed Archway Highgate. The Northern Heights programme did not go to plan. Between war, lack of money, and Greenbelt legislation, much of the scheme was abandoned. The old Great Northern Railway station at Highgate was also abandoned, but the new tunnel was dug and the new platforms are there to this day. Back at Archway, for some reason the station was renamed to Highgate Archway in 1941, and then in 1947 to just Archway, as it remains. In the 1970s, London Transport had to replace a number of the escalators on the Underground, and they took this opportunity to rebuild some of their stations. The one at Archway would be rebuilt into the base of a tower block, known as Archway Tower. This was completed in 1977. I am not a fan of the modern Archway station, at least on the surface. As at Lancaster Gate, it feels like a bare minimum station. There's absolutely zero architectural flair. It couldn't be much more obvious that the tower block took priority here. Below the surface, though, there are some more classic features that go some way to redeeming it. Archway is still a major transport interchange. The trams are long gone, but there are plenty of buses. These days, there's also out-of-station interchange with Upper Holloway on the overground Suffragette line, provided you can get between the two within 20 minutes. Archway is not the most exciting station, visually speaking, but it's useful, and it has a good service. All in all, I wouldn't call myself an arch-enemy. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this towering tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the accuracy to my name change. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.